Yes, and on an empty belly, too. But, however, seeing I was there, I stepped into Carol's yard and bought the filly. I baited him 40 guineas of her, too. And, you see, quite apart from the foals she'll bring, it'll be a remarkable saving, since she'll train with Hautboy and Whiskers. With her to bring out their mettle, I'll lay 50 to 1 on placing Hautboy in the Worrell Stakes. I long to see her, said Sophie, with a sinking heart. She disliked most horses, except those of the very gentle kind, and she particularly disliked these running horses, even though they descended through old bald Peg from Flying Childers and the Derby Arabian himself. She disliked them for many reasons, but she was better at disguising her feelings than her husband, and with a happy, eager look he ran on unchecked. She'll be up sometime in the forenoon. The only thing I'm not quite pleased about is the new stable floor. If only we could have had some sun and a good brisk northeaster, it would have dried out completely. Nothing so bad for a horse's hooves as remaining damp. How's your mamma this morning? She seems quite well, I thank you, Jack. A little remaining headache, but she ate a couple of eggs and a bowl of gruel, and she'll come down with the children. She's quite excited about seeing the doctors, and she's dressed earlier than usual. What can be keeping Bondon? Said Jack, glancing at the stern regulator, his astronomical clock. Perhaps he fell off again, said Sophie. Killick was there to prop him up. No, it's 10 to 1 they're prating about their horsemanship in the Brown Bear Tap, the infernal lubbers. Bondon was Captain Aubrey's coxswain, Killick his steward. And whenever it could be managed, they moved with him from one command to the next. Both had been bred to the sea from their earliest years. Bondon, indeed, had been born between two of the Indefatigable's lower-deck guns, and while both were prime man-of-war's men, neither was a great hand with a horse. Yet it was clear to all that, in common decency, the mail addressed to the commanding officer of the Sea Fencibles had to be fetched by a mounted man, and daily the two traversed the downs on a powerful thick-set cob, conveniently low to the ground. A powerful thick-set woman, Mrs. Williams, Captain Aubrey's mother-in-law, walked in, followed by a nurse with the baby, and a one-legged seaman shepherding the two little girls. Most of the servants in Ashgrove Cottage were sailors, partly because of the extreme difficulty of inducing maids to stay within reach of Mrs. Williams's tongue. Upon seamen, however, long inured to the admonition of the boatswain and his mates, its lash fell unregarded, and in any case its virulence was much diminished since they were men, and since, in fact, they kept the place as trim as a royal yacht. The rigid lines of the garden shrubbery might not be to everyone's taste, nor the white-painted stones that bordered every path, but no housekeeper could fail to be impressed by the gleaming floors, sanded, swabbed, and flogged dry every day before sunrise, nor by the blaze of copper in the spotless kitchen, the gleaming window-panes, the paint perpetually renewed. "Good morning to you, ma'am," said Jack, rising. "I trust I see you well." "Good morning, Commodore, that is to say, Captain. You know I never complain, but I have a list here," waving a paper with her symptoms written upon it, "that will make the doctors stare. Will the hairdresser be here before them, I wonder? We're not to be talking about me, however. Here is your son, Commodore, that is to say, Captain. He has cut his first tooth." She led the nurse forward by the elbow, and Jack gazed into the little, pink, jolly, surprisingly human face among all the wool. George smiled at him, chuckled, and displayed his tooth. Jack thrust his forefinger into the wrapping and said, "How are you coming along, eh? Prime, I dare say. Capital! The baby looked startled, even stunned. The nurse backed away. Mrs. Williams said, "How can you call out so loud, Mr. Aubrey?" with a reproachful look. and Sophie took the child into her arms, whispering, "There, there, my precious lamb." The women gathered round young George, telling one another that babies had sensitive ears. A thunderclap might throw them into fits, little boys far more delicate than girls. Jack felt a momentary and quite ignoble pang of jealousy at the sight of the women, particularly Sophie, concentrating their idiot love and devotion upon the little creature. But he had barely time to be ashamed of it. He had barely time to reflect, "I have been Queen of the May too long," before Amos Dray, formerly boatswain's mate in HMS Surprise, and in the line of duty the most conscientious, impartial flogger in the fleet before he lost his leg, shaded his mouth with his hand, and in a deep rumble whispered, "Toe the line, my dears." The two little pudding-faced twin girls in clean pinafores stepped forward to a particular mark on the carpet, and together, piping high and shrill, they cried, "Good morning, sir." "Good morning, Charlotte. Good morning, Fanny," said their father, bending down until his breeches creaked to kiss them. "Why, Fanny, you have a lump on your forehead." "I'm not Fanny," said Charlotte, scowling. "I'm Charlotte." "But you're wearing a blue pinafore," said Jack. "Because Fanny put on mine, and she fetched me a swipe with a slip of the bloody swab," said Charlotte, with barely contained passion. Jack cast an apprehensive look at Mrs. Williams and Sophie, but they were still cooing over the baby, and almost at the same moment Bondon brought in the post. He put it down, a leather bag with Ash Grove Cottage engraved on its brass plate, and the children, their grandmother, and their attendants leaving the room at this point, he begged pardon for being late. The fact of the matter was, it was market day down there, horses and cattle. "Crowded, I dare say." "Uncommon, sir. But I found Mr. Michael John and told him you was not attending at the office till Saturday." Bondon hesitated. Jack gave him a questioning look, and he went on, "The fact of the matter is, Killick made a purchase. A legal purchase, which he asked me to tell you first, Your Honour." "Aye?" said Jack, unlocking the bag. "A nag, I suppose. Well, I wish him joy of it. He may put it in the old byre." "Not exactly a nag, sir, though it was in a halter. 2 legs and a skirt, if I may say so. A wife, sir." "What in God's name does he want with a wife?" cried Jack, staring. "Why, son," said Bondon, blushing and looking quickly away from Sophie, "I can't rightly say, but he bought one legal. It seems her husband and she didn't agree, so he brought her to market in a halter, and Killick he bought her legal, laid down the pewter in sight of one and all, and shook hands on it. There were 3 to choose on." "But you cannot possibly sell your wife. Treat women like cattle," cried Sophie. "Oh, fie, Jack, it's perfectly barbarous." "It does seem a little strange, but it is the custom, you know. A very old custom. Surely you'll never countenance such a wicked thing, Captain Aubrey." "Why, as to that, I shouldn't like to go against custom. Common law, too, for all I know. Not unless there was any constraint, undue influence, as they say. Where would the Navy be without we followed our customs? Let him come in." "Well, Killick," he said, when the pair stood before him, his steward, an ugly, slab-sided, middle-aged man, rendered more awkward than usual by his present bashfulness, the young woman, a snapping, black-eyed piece, a perfect sailor's delight. "Well, Killick, I trust you're not rushing into matrimony without due consideration. Matrimony is a very serious thing." "Oh, no, sir, I considered of it. Why, the best part of 20 minutes. There was 3 to choose on, and this here," looking fondly at his purchase, "was the pick of the bunch. But, Killick, now I come to think of it, you had a wife in Mahon. She washed my shirts. You mustn't commit bigamy, you know. It's against the law. You certainly had a wife in Mahon." "Which I had too, Your Honour, t'other in Wapping Dock, but they was more in the roving, uncertificated line, if you follow me, sir. Not bought legal, the halter put into my hand." "Well," said Jack, "so I suppose you want to add her to the establishment. You'll have to go in front of the parson first, however. Cut along to the rectory." "Aye, aye, sir," said Killick. "Rectory it is." "Lord, Sophie," said Jack, when they were alone once more, "what a coil!" He opened the bag. "One from the Admiralty, another from the Sick and Hurt Board, and one that looks as though it must be from Charles York. Yes, that's his seal for me. And 2 for Stephen, care of you." "I wish I could take care of him, poor dear," said Sophie, looking at them. "These are from Diana, too." She laid them on a side table to wait with another, addressed in the same bold, determined hand to Stephen Maturin, Esquire, M.D., and gazed at them in silence. Diana Villiers was Sophie's cousin, a slightly younger woman, one with a far more dashing style and a black-haired, dark blue-eyed beauty that some preferred to Mrs. Aubrey's. At a time when Sophie and Jack had been separated, long before their marriage, both Jack and Stephen Maturin had done all they could to win Diana's favours, and in the result Jack very nearly wrecked both his career and his marriage, while Stephen, who had supposed she would marry him at last, had been most cruelly wounded by her departure for America under the protection of a Mr. Johnson, so wounded that he'd lost much of his taste for life. He'd supposed she would marry him, for although his reason told him that a woman of her connections, beauty, pride, and ambition couldn't be an equal match for the illegitimate son of an Irish officer in the service of His Most Catholic Majesty and Catalan lady, a short, disagreeably plain man, whose ostensible status was that of a naval surgeon, no more, his heart was entirely lost to her, and to his infinite cost it had overruled his head. Even before we heard she was in England, I knew that something was working on his mind, poor dear Stephen, said Sophie. She would have added her ludicrous proof: a new wig, new coats, a dozen of the finest cambric shirts. But since she loved Stephen as few brothers are ever loved, she couldn't bear any ridicule to touch him. She said, "Jack, why don't you find him a decent servant? At the worst of times, Killick would never have allowed you to go out in a shirt a fortnight old, odd stockings, and that dreadful old coat. Why has he never had a steady, reliable man?" Jack knew very well why Stephen had never kept a servant for any length of time, never a man who could grow used to his ways, but had contented himself with casual and preferably illiterate marines or ship's boys, or a half-witted member of the afterguard. For Dr. Maturin, as well as being a naval surgeon, was one of the Admiralty's most highly valued intelligence agents, and secrecy was essential to the preservation of his life and the lives of his many contacts in the vast area controlled by Bonaparte, to say nothing of the prosecution of his work. This had necessarily come to Jack's knowledge in the course of their service together, but he did not intend to pass it on even to Sophie. And now he made a reply to the effect that, whereas by steady application you might hope to persuade a parcel of pig-headed mules, nothing, no, not purchase upon purchase, would ever shift Stephen from his chosen path. "Diana could by waving her fan," said Sophie. Her face was not well suited for crossness, but now it expressed a variety of cross emotions: indignation for Stephen, displeasure at this renewed complication, and something of the disapproval or even jealousy of a woman with a very modest sexual impulse for one in whom it was quite the reverse, the whole tempered by an unwillingness to think or speak unkindly. "I dare say